Hello and welcome to this short guide on how to set up saving and loading for your game in Crayta. So saving and loading is a way for us to store things when our player leaves the game that they're playing at the moment. So say they're playing this game here and I want to store their progress. That would be a good opportunity to use the save data stuff in the API. And then when the player comes back, I'd like to be able to load that data back in and allow them to resume where they left off. And so that's essentially the crux of what we're going to be talking about in this saving and loading thing. Now, it could be things like their progress, but it could also be their high score, or it could be, you know, the name of their character in your game, or what other kind of data that you might want them to be able to save. And so in my game, I want to save the progress. So at the moment, when the player gets to this checkpoint over here, when they bump into it, it calls this function on a checkpoint script, which is save checkpoint. And essentially that sends this set spawn event to my user, which already has a respawn kind of script attached. And what that's doing is it's saving the spawn point to that. But I'm also going to capture that in a new script. So if I go over to the user template, I've got this user save and load script folder. And in there, I've got the save spawn script, which is here. And essentially, I'm capturing that set spawn event again. So it'll run in both scripts. And I'm saving the name of the checkpoint that they just got to a table. So a table is essentially a structure that we can use in Lua to store data. And we can store, so we set up the table on the init function. And then we can add any kind of properties we want to that table with a dot notation there and then the name of the property. So at this point, I'm creating the property checkpoint if it doesn't already exist, or if it does already exist, this will just replace what was in there. And then after that line of code on line 15, line 16 is the crux of the saving and loading. So this self set save data will essentially save whatever table is passed within those brackets. So I've got this save table table with the checkpoint as a child, as a property of that table. And so then I'm saving that table here. There we go. So that's essentially then stored in relation to this script behind the scenes. And so a player can now leave and that data will persist and remain. And then when they come back, we need to load that data in. So the first step is getting data saving. And you can check that the data is saved with print statements and stuff like that. And then the next step is to get it loading in. So in order to get things loading in, I took a bit of inspiration from the Tycoon starter template, which is a really good example of how to save and load more complex data. So if I go here, I've got a locator called game, and on there is essentially my load game script. I should also stress before we go any further that the kind of data that you can save has to be primitive data types. So that's either a string, a number, or a Boolean. You can't save things like entities or players or anything like that because they're too complex and that would take up too much data. And it's just not very efficient to do that. So the best way to do it is to store things like a string. So you could get the name of a checkpoint like I've got here, or you could even have like a list of IDs, which are numbers associated with it, or however you want to do that. I've tried to keep it as simple as possible here, but essentially, yeah, you can numbers, strings, and Booleans are essentially the main kinds of data that you can save there. Now back to loading in. So if you take a look at the API, there's this really handy function called OnUserLogin, which is an API hook, which is called by the Crayta game engine when a user logs in. So I've attached this function to a script, to a locator just in the game. It doesn't particularly matter where. This function will get called whenever a user logs in. And at that point, I'm sending the onload event to the user scripts. And then that will come back with a function when it's loaded. So if we look at where this is going to the save spawn script, which is attached to the user. And you can see that it will call this function because we've done the center script function call. It will call this onload function. At which point this goes and gets any save data associated with this script. And then once it's done that, it will run this function. So this GetSaveData is what's called an asynchronous method, which means that it doesn't happen on the main thread because this could take a while and we don't want the game to lock up. So this will happen asynchronously. It'll happen slightly on a different thread, if you will. Although, you know, the undergrowth of the actual work involved in that is probably different from threading. But essentially, yeah, it's an asynchronous method, which means that it could come back at any point with the saved data. So we have to wait for that to happen. The way we do that is we essentially pass in a callback, which will only run once that function's been completed. At which point this function gets run and it comes back with whatever saved data it's found. So I can save that saved data to the same table. So essentially overwriting the table that is created at the beginning by default. This empty table here is then overwritten by that. And then call whatever callback I've passed to this function. So if we look at the load game script, I've passed this function here. And that is then stored in this callback variable. And at that point, after I've finished getting the data, we then call back the function. So it's kind of like a chain going, calling, get the data, and then, oh, I've got the data, save it here, and then call whatever function needs to happen after that. So at that point, this function gets called, and all it does is it goes to find whatever checkpoint was stored. So it passes back this checkpoint, the name of the checkpoint, goes and gets that checkpoint if it exists, and checks that it exists first and all that sort of stuff, and then spawn the user at that specific point. So then we do this user send to scripts set spawn point, and then we do user spawn player. You can pass in a user template there if you want to, or nil if you just want the default user template, and the locator that you want them to spawn at. And that's how we spawn a player, incidentally. And that's it. Essentially, at that point, the user will now be spawned at the location they last got to and that was saved within the game. So hopefully that's been helpful. This has just been a really quick run through. If you want a more detailed run through of how to do saving and loading, then check out the slightly longer version of this same guide. And I look forward to seeing your save and load scripts, decorating the community, and give us a shout in Discord if you get stuck, and check in with the community, and everyone helps each other out, so you can always do that. And I look forward to seeing you in Crayta.